"Your house isn't yours anymore, Evelyn. It's for my baby," Sophia said, like she was announcing something as ordinary as the weather. And for a second I thought I had misheard her, because people don't just say things like that in real life. Not at a Sunday dinner table with roast chicken still warm and the scent of rosemary hanging in the air. Not with my own parents sitting right there across from me, nodding as if this were a conversation we had all agreed to have long before I walked into the room. But no one corrected her. No. One laughed, and that silence settled heavier than anything she could have said. So I set my fork down carefully, aligning it beside the plate the way I always did, buying myself a few seconds to study their faces, searching for some trace of hesitation, some flicker that would tell me this was a misunderstanding. But all I saw was certainty, calm, rehearsed certainty, and that was when something inside me shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, almost imperceptible click, like a door closing somewhere deep in the house I had worked 30 years to pay off. The house she was now claiming as if it had been waiting for her all along. I didn't respond right away. I didn't ask questions, because I had learned over time that the first reaction is the one people expect, the one they prepare for. And I could feel, in the way my mother folded her hands and my father leaned back in his chair, that they were ready for resistance, ready to explain, to justify, to push harder if they needed to. So instead I looked at Sophia, really looked at her, at the way she rested her hand over her stomach like it was an argument in itself, like it granted her authority over everything in the room. And I wondered how long this had been building, how many conversations had taken place without me, how many decisions had been made in quiet corners while I was at work, paying bills, fixing things, maintaining a life I thought belonged to me. "It just makes sense," my mother added, softly, her voice careful, measured, the same tone she used when she thought she was being reasonable. "You have space. She needs stability. It's temporary, I repeated silently, the word echoing in a way that didn't feel temporary at all, because nothing about their posture suggested this was a request. It felt settled, finalized, like paperwork I hadn't signed but was somehow bound to. And I noticed then the small details I had ignored before, the extra set of keys on the counter, the way Sophia's bag sat near the hallway like it belonged there, the casual ownership in how she spoke, and piece by piece, it started to come together, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow, tightening understanding that I had been excluded from my own life, that somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing me as the one who built this home and started seeing me as the obstacle standing in the way of something they believed was more important. I could have argued. I could have reminded them whose name was on the deed, how many late nights and early mornings it had taken to get here, but I didn't, because arguments only matter when both sides are still listening, and they had already moved past that point. They weren't asking for permission. They were informing me of a decision, and that realization didn't make me angry the way I expected. It made me still, unnervingly still, as if all the noise had drained out of the room and left only clarity behind. I reached for my glass of water, took a small sip, and nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because now I understood what I was dealing with, and more importantly, I understood what I needed to do next, even if they didn't see it yet, even if they thought this was the moment they had taken something from me. Because the truth was, this was the moment they had shown me exactly who they were. And once you see that clearly, there's no going back to the version of the story where everything felt like family. The rest of that dinner passed in a strange, almost rehearsed calm, like everyone had agreed to pretend nothing unusual had just happened. And I played my part just as carefully, asking my father if he still took his coffee black, complimenting my mother on the green beans even though they were slightly overcooked, and listening to Sophia talk about baby names as if she had not just claimed ownership of the walls around us. But beneath that surface politeness, I was observing everything with a clarity I had not felt in years, noticing how my father avoided looking directly at me, how my mother kept smoothing the edge of her napkin as if she needed something to do with her hands, and how Sophia leaned back in her chair with a quiet confidence that only comes when someone believes they have already won. And that confidence told me more than any explanation ever could. It told me this was not an impulsive request. This was a plan, something discussed, agreed upon, justified in conversations I was never part of. And as that understanding settled in, I realized something else just as important. They were expecting me to react emotionally, to argue, to defend, to raise my voice and make this into a scene they could label as unreasonable. Because that would make it easier for them to dismiss me, easier to paint me as the one standing in the way of a growing family. But I had no intention of giving them that. Not anymore. So when the plates were cleared and my mother stood up to gather dishes, I rose with her, offering to help in the same calm tone I had used all evening. And for a brief moment she looked relieved, as if my cooperation confirmed that everything would go according to their expectations. We moved into the kitchen together, the familiar rhythm of running water and clinking porcelain filling the space between us, and she spoke. Without turning around, her voice soft but deliberate, saying that it was only for a little while, that Sophia needed support, that family should come first, phrases that sounded reasonable on the surface but felt hollow when placed against what they were actually asking of me. I dried a plate slowly, letting her words settle without interrupting, because I wanted to hear how far she would go, how fully she would commit to this version of events. And when she finally turned to face me, there was something almost pleading in her expression, as if she needed me to agree not just for Sophia's sake, but to reassure herself that what they were doing was right. And that was when I understood that this was not just about the house. It was about control, about rewriting roles in a way that placed me somewhere smaller, more convenient, more easily moved aside. And I set the plate down carefully before meeting her gaze, not with anger, but with a steadiness she did not seem prepared for. I told her I would think about it. Nothing more, nothing less. And the simplicity of that answer seemed to unsettle her more than any argument would have, because it gave her nothing to push against, no resistance to overcome, just a quiet uncertainty about what I might do next. And when I stepped back into the dining room, Sophia glanced up at me with that same expectant look, as if she were waiting for confirmation that everything had been settled in her favor. And I gave her a small, polite smile, the kind you offer a stranger, not someone who believes they can claim your life as their own. And in that moment I made a decision I did not speak out loud, a decision that felt as calm and precise as everything else I had done that evening. Because if they had spent weeks planning how to take my home from me, then I could spend one night deciding how to take control of the situation back. And the difference was, I would not need their permission to do it. That night, after they left, I did not sit down, I did not turn on the television, and I did not allow myself the comfort of routine, because routine was exactly what they were counting on, the idea that I would go to bed, wake up, and slowly adjust to the new reality they had decided for me. But instead I walked through the house room by room, not as someone who was losing something, but as someone taking inventory, noticing the small details that had always been mine, the faint scratch on the hallway wall from when I moved in my first piece of furniture, the kitchen counter I had measured twice before installing myself, the quiet hum of the refrigerator that had been replaced just 2 years ago with money I had carefully saved, each detail grounding me in a truth they could not rewrite. This was my home, built with my time, my effort, my decisions, and the clarity of that thought made everything else simpler. I was not dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a situation that required action, and action, unlike emotion, could be planned. So I sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook, something I had not used in years, and began listing everything that mattered: ownership documents, utility accounts, spare keys, security access. Each item becoming part of a larger picture that was forming with steady precision. And as I wrote, I realized how much control I actually had. How many of the things they were assuming would simply transfer over to Sophia were still firmly in my hands. And that realization did not make me feel powerful in a dramatic way. It made me feel calm, because control does not need to be loud to be effective. It just needs to be clear. And by the time I finished, the plan was not complicated. It was direct, built on the simple fact that this house, legally and practically, belonged to me. And that meant I had the right to decide who stayed and who did not. The next step was timing, because if they had spent time preparing their move, then I needed to act before that preparation turned into permanence. I checked the clock, just past 9 in the evening. Not too late, not too early, and I reached for my phone, starting with the locksmith whose number I had saved years ago after a neighbor recommended him. The call was brief, professional. I asked if he could come out first thing in the morning, and when he confirmed availability, I scheduled it without hesitation. Then I moved on to the security system, updating access codes, removing the temporary guest profile I had created months ago when my parents visited more frequently. Small changes that might have seemed unnecessary before, but now felt essential. And with each step, the situation became less abstract and more defined. Less about what they wanted and more about what I was choosing to do. I did not rush. I did not second guess, because doubt only creates openings for hesitation, and hesitation was exactly what they were relying on. So when everything was in place, I closed the notebook, turned off the lights, and walked upstairs with a sense of quiet certainty. Not anger, not even resentment, just a steady understanding that by this time tomorrow, things would be different. Not because I had raised my voice or argued at the dinner table, but because I had taken the time to see the situation clearly and respond in a way they had not anticipated. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the familiar darkness, the silence of the house felt different, not uncertain, not threatened, but resolved, like a decision had already been made and was simply waiting for the morning to arrive. Morning came without hesitation, the kind of clear, quiet morning that does not ask questions, and I was already awake before the alarm, lying still for a moment as I let the plan settle into place, not as something uncertain, but as something already in motion. And when I finally got up, there was no rush in my movements, no urgency, just a steady progression through familiar routines that felt sharper, more intentional than usual. I made coffee the same way I always did, measured, precise. The scent filling the kitchen as sunlight began to filter through the blinds, and for a brief second, I allowed myself to appreciate the normalcy of it, because I knew that within a few hours, that normalcy would shift, not disappear, but realign in a way that reflected the truth of who actually lived here, and who did not. The knock on the door came exactly when expected, firm but not intrusive, and when I opened it, the locksmith greeted me with a polite nod, professional and efficient, the kind of person who does not ask unnecessary questions, which was exactly what I needed. I stepped aside and let him in, explaining briefly that I wanted all exterior locks replaced, every entry point secured with new keys, and he got to work immediately, tools laid out with practiced precision as the quiet sound of metal and movement replaced the usual stillness of the house. And as I watched him work, I felt something settle deeper within me. Not relief, not satisfaction, but certainty. Because this was no longer just a plan on paper, it was happening piece by piece, turning intention into reality. I checked my phone once, seeing a message from Sophia that had come in earlier, asking casually what time she could stop by later to bring a few things over. The wording almost careful, as if she were easing into something already decided, and I did not respond right away, not because I was unsure, but because timing mattered, every step mattered, and I wanted everything in place before that conversation happened. By the time the locksmith finished, the house felt subtly different, not in appearance, but in control. The old keys no longer mattered. The assumptions tied to them quietly erased. I paid him, thanked him, and closed the door behind him with a calm finality that echoed more than usual. Then I moved through the rest of the house, double-checking everything. Doors, windows, security codes, each confirmation reinforcing the same simple truth. This space was mine, and it would remain that way. Around mid-morning, my phone rang, my mother's name lighting up the screen, and I answered with the same steady tone I had maintained since the night before. She did not waste time with small talk, asking instead if I had thought about what we discussed, her voice carrying that familiar mix of expectation and reassurance, as if the outcome had already been decided. And I let a brief pause pass before answering, not to create tension, but to make sure my words were clear. I told her that I had made a decision, that the house would not be available, not temporarily, not permanently, and that any plans based on that assumption needed to change. There was silence on the other end, longer this time, heavier, and when she spoke again, there was confusion, then disbelief, as if the possibility of refusal had not been part of their planning at all. She started to explain again, to repeat the same reasoning from the night before, but I did not engage with it. I simply restated my position, calm, direct, without raising my voice. Because clarity does not need volume to be understood, and when the call ended, it was not with agreement, but with a quiet shift in the balance they had assumed was fixed. And I set the phone down knowing that the next part would not come through words, it would come through actions they could not ignore, actions that had already begun. By early afternoon, the house had settled into a quiet that felt earned, not accidental, and I could sense the shift in momentum even before it became visible, because silence, when it follows a firm decision, has a different weight to it. It is no longer uncertain, it is resolved, and I used that time deliberately, not to wait, but to reinforce everything I had already set in motion. I gathered the remaining spare keys from the drawer in the hallway, the ones I had handed out over the years. Without much thought, to family, to convenience, to a version of trust that now felt outdated, and I placed them on the kitchen counter one by one, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a practical acknowledgement that access had been too easily given before and would not be handled that way again. Then I moved on to something even more important. I reviewed the documents I had listed the night before, pulling out the folder that contained the deed, the insurance paperwork, the utility statements. Each page a quiet confirmation of ownership that required no interpretation, no debate, just fact, and I left them neatly arranged on the table, not because I needed to prove anything to myself, but because I understood that soon, there would likely be a conversation where facts would matter more than feelings, and I intended to be prepared for that moment without scrambling, without reacting, just presenting what was already true. Around 2 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Sophia, shorter than the first, more direct, asking if she could come by in an hour to start bringing some of her things. The wording had changed, the assumption more visible now, less cautious, and I read it twice before setting the phone down, not answering immediately, because again, timing mattered. I walked through the house once more, slower this time, not checking for flaws, but confirming alignment, making sure that everything reflected the decision I had made. The new locks, the secured entries, the quiet order of each room, nothing out of place, nothing left ambiguous, and only then did I pick up my phone and respond, keeping my message simple and clear. I told her that it was not a good time, that the house was not available for moving anything in, and that she needed to make other arrangements. No explanation, no apology, just a statement that matched the reality she had not yet accepted. The response came quickly, almost immediately, a mix of confusion and disbelief that read more like a challenge than a question, asking what I meant, reminding me of what had been discussed, as if repetition could turn assumption into agreement. And I did not engage with the tone. I replied once more, just as calmly, repeating the same message in slightly different words, reinforcing the boundary without expanding on it, because boundaries do not need to be defended when they are clear, they just need to be held. And after that, I put the phone down and let the silence return, knowing that the next move would not come through text, it would come in person, and sure enough, less than an hour later, I heard a car pull into the driveway. The sound distinct enough to recognize even without looking, followed by the soft but deliberate closing of a car door, and then a pause, as if whoever was outside was taking a moment to prepare, to gather whatever words they believed would change the outcome. And I remained where I was, standing in the living room, not tense, not defensive, just steady, because I had already made the decision, already taken the steps that supported it, and whatever conversation was about to happen would not be about whether I would give in. It would be about how clearly I would hold the line I had drawn. And as the knock came at the door, firm and expectant, I took a breath, not to calm myself, but to center the certainty that had been building since the night before, and then I walked forward to answer it, fully aware that this moment was not the beginning of conflict, it was the continuation of a choice I had already made. I opened the door without hesitation, and there she was, Sophia, standing on the porch with one hand resting lightly on her stomach and the other holding her phone, her expression already set in that familiar mix of expectation and disbelief, as if she still believed this situation would resolve itself in her favor the moment we spoke face to face. And for a brief second, neither of us said anything, the silence stretching just long enough to make it clear that this was not going to unfold the way she had imagined. She glanced past me instinctively, trying to look into the house as if confirming that it was still there, still accessible, still something she could step into. But I remained where I was, steady in the doorway, not blocking her aggressively, just present enough to make the boundary unmistakable. "I got your message," she said finally, her tone controlled but carrying an edge of confusion, like she was waiting for me to correct myself. to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, and I nodded once, acknowledging that without inviting anything further. She shifted her weight slightly, her voice becoming more insistent as she continued, explaining that she had already started packing, that this was what we had all agreed on, that Mom and Dad were counting on me to do the right thing. Each sentence layered with the same assumption that agreement had already been given, and I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I wanted her to hear the absence of resistance turn into something else entirely. When she finished, there was that same pause again, the kind that expects immediate compliance, and I met her gaze calmly before responding, telling her in a clear, even tone that there had been no agreement, that I had been informed of a decision I did not accept, and that the house was not available for her or anyone else to move into. I did not raise my voice. I did not add emotion. I simply stated the reality she had not prepared for, and I could see the shift happen in her expression, subtle at first, then sharper. As the confidence she arrived with began to falter, she tried again, this time with a different approach, reminding me that she was pregnant, that she needed stability, that family was supposed to support each other. The words echoing what my mother had said, but now delivered with more urgency, as if repeating them would create leverage, and I let her finish again before responding. Because urgency does not change facts, and I told her that her situation did not change ownership, that needing something did not automatically make it available, and that support did not mean surrendering my home. There was a flicker of frustration then, quickly masked, as she took a small step forward as if to move past me. And that was when the new reality became unavoidable, because the door did not open wider. The space did not shift to accommodate her. It remained exactly as it was, controlled, defined, and she stopped, realizing in that moment that access was no longer something she could assume. Her eyes moved briefly to the lock, noticing the subtle difference, the quiet detail that confirmed what words alone might not have, and the realization settled in, not dramatically, but undeniably. "You changed the locks," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, and I nodded again. Because there was no reason to deny it, no reason to soften it. It was simply part of the decision I had made. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of that action filling the space between us more than any argument could have, because it was not about what I was saying anymore. It was about what I had already done, and that difference, that shift from discussion to action, was something she had not accounted for. And as she stood there, processing it, I remained calm, steady, not waiting for her approval, not seeking her understanding, just holding the line that had already been drawn, knowing that whatever happened next would not change the fact that this house, and the decisions about it, were mine. She did not step back right away, and for a moment it felt like she was trying to decide whether to push further or to change direction, her eyes shifting between me and the door as if searching for some opening that was no longer there. And when she spoke again, her tone had changed, less confident now, edged with something closer to frustration, asking how I could do this to her, how I could make things harder when she was already dealing with so much. And I listened without interrupting, not because her words carried weight over my decision, but because I understood that this was the stage where emotion replaces certainty, where the plan begins to unravel and the person holding it tries to rebuild it in real time. She mentioned our parents again, said they would be disappointed, that they were expecting me to help, and I noticed how the responsibility kept being redirected, shifted onto me as if their expectations automatically became my obligation. And I let that settle for a second before responding, calmly, clearly, telling her that expectations do not create ownership, and that decisions made without me do not bind me. The words landed differently this time, not as something she could dismiss, but as something she had to process, and I could see it in the way her posture changed, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her expression tightened as she realized that repeating the same arguments was not going to change the outcome. There was a pause then, longer than before, and in that silence, the dynamic shifted. Again, because she was no longer speaking from a place of certainty, she was reacting to a reality she had not prepared for. And then came the question that revealed everything. She asked what she was supposed to do now, not in a demanding tone, but in one that carried genuine uncertainty, and that question was different, because it was no longer about taking something from me. It was about facing the consequences of assumptions that had not been confirmed. I did not answer immediately, not because I did not have one, but because I wanted the moment to be clear, to stand on its own without being softened or redirected. And when I did speak, I kept it simple, telling her that she would need to make her own arrangements, that there were other options, other places, other solutions that did not involve taking over my home. I did not offer suggestions. I did not step into the role they had tried to assign me, because that role was exactly what I had stepped away from, and she seemed to understand that, even if she did not like it. Her expression shifting again, this time into something quieter, less confrontational, but still unsettled. She glanced back toward the driveway for a second, as if considering whether to leave or to try one more time. And then she looked at me again, searching for something in my face, maybe hesitation, maybe doubt, but finding neither, because there was none left to find. Everything that needed to be decided had already been decided, and this conversation was simply the moment where that decision became visible, undeniable. And after a few more seconds, she nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to argue against. And without another word, she turned and walked back toward her car, each step slower than when she arrived. The confidence she had carried with her replaced by a quiet understanding that things had not gone the way she expected, and I remained in the doorway until she reached the car and got in, the sound of the engine starting breaking the silence for a brief moment before it faded again as she drove away. And when the driveway was empty, I closed the door gently, not with force, not with finality, just with the same steady control I had maintained from the beginning, because this was not about shutting anyone out in anger. It was about maintaining what was mine with clarity. And as I stood there in the quiet of the house, I could feel the shift fully settle, not as tension, but as resolution, the kind that does not need to be revisited, only upheld. The quiet that followed did not last long, not because anything changed inside the house, but because the outside world was already catching up to what had just happened, and I knew it would, because decisions like this do not stay contained. They ripple outward through the people who expected a different outcome. And by early evening, my phone confirmed it, the screen lighting up with my father's name, and I let it ring once, twice, not to avoid it, but to meet it on my own terms. And when I answered, his voice carried none of the calm distance he usually maintained. There was urgency there, controlled but unmistakable, asking what had happened, why Sophia had come back upset, why I had made things more complicated than they needed to be. And I listened, not interrupting, letting him lay out the version of events he had already accepted, the one where I had disrupted a plan rather than corrected an assumption. And when he finished, I responded the same way I had all day, steady, clear, explaining that there had been no agreement, that the house was not available, and that I had made that clear to Sophia directly. There was a pause on the line, shorter than before, followed by a shift in tone, less questioning, more insistent, as he reminded me that family supports each other, that this was temporary, that I had the space and they needed it more, the same phrases, the same reasoning, repeated as if consistency would make it true, and I recognized the pattern immediately. Not new, just more concentrated, and I answered him without raising my voice, telling him that support does not mean giving up ownership, that temporary does not mean undefined, and that decisions about my home are mine to make. The silence that followed was heavier this time, not uncertain, but resistant, like he was recalibrating in real time, trying to find a different angle. And when he spoke again, it was softer, almost measured, asking if I really wanted to create distance over something that could have been resolved easily. And that question was different, because it shifted the focus from the house to the relationship, implying that my decision was the cause of any strain that followed. And I let that settle for a moment before answering. Not defensively, not reactively, but with the same clarity I had maintained throughout, telling him that distance does not come from boundaries. It comes from expectations that ignore them, and that what could have been resolved easily would have required a conversation, not an assumption. There was no immediate response after that, just the quiet sound of him breathing on the other end of the line, processing something he had not expected to hear, and eventually, he said that they would need to talk about this, that things could not stay this way. And I agreed with him on that point, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood that clarity often forces conversations that had been avoided. And when the call ended, it did not feel like a conflict had escalated. It felt like a reality had been acknowledged, even if it was not accepted yet. And I set the phone down, noticing how different the house felt compared to just 24 hours earlier. Not quieter, not emptier, but more defined, like every space had settled into its intended purpose again. And as I moved through the rooms, turning on lights as evening set in, I realized that what had changed was not the house itself, but my position within it. No longer passive, no longer accommodating by default, but deliberate, aware, and in control. And that shift was not something that could be undone by a phone call or a conversation, because it was not built on emotion. It was built on decision, and decisions, once acted on, create a kind of clarity that does not fade easily. And as the night settled in, I allowed myself a moment to pause, not to question what I had done, but to recognize the weight of it, not as something heavy, but as something solid, something that would hold even as the conversations continued, because they would, and when they did, I would meet them the same way I had met everything else so far, not with resistance, not with hesitation, but with the same steady certainty that had carried me through the day. The next morning arrived with a kind of stillness that felt earned rather than uncertain, and for the first time in days, there were no immediate calls, no messages waiting to be answered, just the quiet rhythm of a house that was exactly as it should be. And I moved through it with a calm awareness that nothing had been taken from me, nothing had been lost, only clarified. And as I poured my coffee and stood by the window, watching the light settle across the driveway, I realized that the situation had shifted in a way that would not reverse itself, not because of stubbornness, but because the truth had finally been established in a way that could not be ignored. And that truth was simple. This house, this space, this life had boundaries, and those boundaries mattered. Later that morning, my phone buzzed again, but this time the message was different. It was from my mother, shorter than usual, more measured, asking if we could talk. Not about moving in, not about arrangements, just talk. And that alone told me everything I needed to know about how much had changed in such a short time. Because the assumption had been replaced with a request, and that shift, small as it might seem, was significant. I did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because I understood that conversations following clarity require a different kind of attention. And when I did reply, I agreed, setting a time later that day, on neutral terms, not as someone being convinced, but as someone willing to engage. When the time came, the conversation was quieter than I expected, less about pushing for a different outcome and more about understanding how we had reached this point. My mother spoke first, acknowledging that perhaps they had moved too quickly, that they had assumed I would agree without asking. And while her words were careful, they carried something genuine beneath them, a recognition that something had been overlooked. And I listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing the space for that acknowledgement to exist without immediately reshaping it. When she finished, I responded in the same steady tone I had used all along, explaining that the issue had never been about helping. It had been about being excluded from a decision that directly affected me, about being treated as if my role was to accommodate rather than to choose. And as I spoke, I could feel the difference in how my words were received this time, not dismissed, not redirected, but considered, because the situation no longer allowed for easy assumptions. My father joined the conversation briefly, his tone less insistent than the day before, more reserved, as if he too was adjusting to the reality that had already taken shape. And while there was no complete agreement by the end of that discussion, there was something else, something quieter but more important, an understanding that things would not move forward without clear communication, without respect for boundaries that had now been firmly established. And when the call ended, it did not feel like a resolution in the traditional sense, but it did feel like a reset, a point from which something more balanced could eventually grow. And as I set my phone down and looked around the house, I understood that what had happened was not just about refusing a request. It was about redefining how I would be treated moving forward, about ensuring that my place in this family was not something that could be quietly adjusted without my voice. And that realization did not come with pride or relief, but with a steady sense of alignment, as if everything had finally settled into the position it should have been in all along. And as the day continued, the house remained exactly what it had always been, not just a structure, not just a place, but something I had built and maintained on my own terms. And now, finally, something that was recognized that way by everyone else as well.